is Kyle Hyman, and joining us to talk about the life of Father Willie Doyle. He is a priest, a chaplain, and he's documented in the book To Raise the Fallen, a selection of the war letters, prayers, and spiritual writings of Father Willie Doyle. Joining us to talk about him is Dr. Patrick Kenny. Thanks for being here, Dr. Kenny.
Great to talk to you, Kyle.
All the way from Dublin, which was the hometown of Father Willie Doyle, is that correct?
That's correct, yeah. Father Doyle was born here in Dublin in 1873 and spent most of his life in Ireland, apart from the last 2 years of his life, which he spent in the trenches in the First World War in Belgium.
And how have you been personally impacted by the life and the stories of Father Willie Doyle?
I live in a town that's about 2 miles from where Father Doyle was born and grew up, and about 8 years ago I read the original biography of him that was written in the 1920s, and I was absolutely astounded, firstly that I had never heard of him before, but secondly I was astounded that somebody of that character, that desire for holiness, and indeed of that holiness and courage that he showed in the war and through all his life, lived so close to me, and I was really taken by his life and by his message. I set up a website about him, fatherdoyle.com, which I update daily with quotes from his writings, and I've written and spoken extensively about him, and now I've produced this book in the centenary of the end of the First World War, actually next week, so it's timely.
And what originally got you excited about his writings? What was it about them?
Well, what struck me was an incredible holiness, an incredible generosity, and an incredible courage. I read a lot of biographies of saints, and I think biographies of saints are very interesting for a number of reasons. They give you an insight into history, they give you an insight into psychology. Most saints live interesting lives. They also give you practical spiritual advice and ways of living. And when I read the original life of Father Doyle, what struck me was that this is a man, and this is a big claim I'm making, but I believe it to be true. This is a man who can stand in the company of the greatest of saints that we all know, the greatest of canonized saints, because he left behind him a legacy of action, but also a lot of private spiritual writings that reveal a life of tremendous holiness, a dogged pursuit of holiness in his daily actions. He didn't find it easy. Like all of us, he had to struggle. He had his faults. He fought quite hard to overcome those faults with God's grace. So for me, I think there's something in Father Doyle's life and writings that can appeal to anybody of any age and indeed of any background. And there are many people who have been alienated from the church who are maybe taking a step closer because of the authenticity we see in the life of Father Doyle.
Did he have some common themes in those writings? Yes.
I mean, I think one common theme was just to be faithful to what you're doing every day. You have daily duties, and that's where we find holiness. So if we're called to do something great, yes, we may end up doing that, but we'll only do that if we're faithful in the daily little tasks that we're doing. And in that sense, he mirrors St. Therese, who actually was born in the same year as he. He was the same age as her, although he died at a later age than her. And he visited her grave and read the story of a soul, so I think that had an impact on him.
And one of the things you talk about in the book is that from a young age, he actually wanted to be a martyr. So would you describe his death as a martyrdom?
Yes, I would say that he was a martyr of a sort. Traditionally, when we talk about martyrs, we talk about people who die for the faith. Mm-hmm. Father Doyle was somebody who died for charity. So in that sense, he's a martyr of charity. And interestingly, about a year or two ago, Pope Francis proclaimed a new pathway to canonization for martyrs of charity. That is, people who consciously offer their lives, not for the faith, although Father Doyle would willingly have done that, but who offer their lives out of love for others. And we see other saints who have done that. For instance, St. Maximilian Kolbe offered his life in exchange for a father of a family who the Nazis wanted to kill.
Sure.
Father Doyle offered his life while going out to rescue wounded soldiers, and that's exactly how he died.
And going back to that childhood desire to be a martyr, I wouldn't say that's a normal thing for a child to desire. Where did that come from?
He read the lives of the martyrs. He was always reading lives of saints himself. He read the lives of martyrs, and I think they inspired him greatly. But we see the same in some other saints. I mean, St. Teresa of Avila and her brother both ran away from home as children. They wanted to go off to find Muslims to try and convert them, with the knowledge that they probably would be killed if they tried to do that. So it's not an entirely unusual thing for a child to be inspired by heroism, by stories of heroism, and to want to go and imitate them. And that's why I think for families, if we want to raise our children to follow the faith, I think introducing them to the lives of the saints is very important, because they are inspiring and they grasp the imagination.
And what would you say families could learn from the life of Father Willie Doyle?
I would look at his early life. They prayed at meals, they prayed together during the day, and they were very generous. Poor people in the area came to the family home looking for alms, looking for money, and the family were always very generous to them. So I think that had an impact on the young Father Doyle. So I think living the faith in the family and acting it out through active apostolate and generosity is very important.
We're talking with Dr. Patrick Kenny, who has written the book To Raise the Fallen, a selection of the war letters, prayers, and spiritual writings of Father Willie Doyle. And what does Father Doyle show us about the priesthood in general, would you say?
Well, Father Doyle, I'll just step back and say that, in fact, three of the Doyle family, Father Willie and two of his brothers, entered the priesthood. One of them died 10 days before being ordained. The other brother became a Jesuit like Father Willie. So he had a great esteem for the priesthood. He did a lot to promote the priesthood, and he wrote some best-selling pamphlets while he was alive, and they've had a huge impact even after he died. For instance, I got a letter a number of years ago from a retired priest in England who had been a soldier in the Second World War, and his military chaplain gave him a copy of one of Father Willie's pamphlets on the priesthood, and he became a priest because of it. And some years later, he met that chaplain and said, "I want to thank you for giving me that pamphlet. It's the reason I've become a priest." And the chaplain said, "You're the 12th soldier I know who became a priest because of that pamphlet." So Father Willie's writings on his life had a huge impact in promoting the priesthood. But a key thing that inspired him in a lot of what he did was to make reparation for the sins of priests. And that's why I think he's a very topical figure right now for the situation in which we find ourselves in the church. So again and again we see that he did penances to make up to our Lord for the sins that priests committed. And the very last thing that he wrote in his private diary on the 10th anniversary of his ordination, and less than 3 weeks before he died, was that he offered up all of his sufferings in the trenches in reparation for those sins of priests.
Wow. How has he inspired you personally?
Well, I think maybe you need to ask my wife and see whether I have been inspired personally, whether I've improved by getting to know him better. I think for me, just being generous. I mean, Father Doyle was a very generous person, and he continuously said yes. He said yes to what God asked of him. And as he got older, God asked more and more of him, to the point where he was asked ultimately to go to the trenches to share in the sufferings of the soldiers and to lay down his life. That's not something I could foresee in my future, but I think I'm inspired to be more generous and to say yes when opportunities of service come up. I'm not always great at doing that. Father Willie was a very cheerful person, and even despite the sufferings that he saw in the war. So I try to follow that, but again, not very successfully. But that's part of the challenge of a Catholic and a Christian, is to every day try and be a little bit better, and I think that's one of the ways in which he inspires me.
And you talked about him going in and rescuing soldiers, also obviously as a priest administering the sacraments. But one of the things, he also literally buried the dead. Is that common for military chaplains at the time, that they would actually physically bury the dead?
At the time, it seems that it was, and also they were the ones who sent letters home to the families to say that their loved one, their son or their brother or their husband even, had been killed. And we see this, it was very tough for him. He got used to it, I think, by the end, but at the start it was very tough to have to go out to dig the grave, to bury the body, sometimes only burying body parts because that was all that was left. And first few times I think it was tough. It was also a dangerous thing to do, because in the First World War it was very different from how we understand any war before that, or how we understand wars now. Basically the men lived in trenches, in a hole in the ground 6 or 7 feet deep. If you're in the trench, you're relatively safe, not entirely, but relatively safe. if you get out of the trench, you're exposed to gunfire and to bombs and shells. Mm-hmm. And obviously you've got to get out of the trench to bury the dead. And numerous times in his letters he records how he had to do it at night in the dark or trying to hide his torch, because if he was seen, he would be blown up.
Wow. And I mean, the way you describe it, it sounds like such a dark and depressing situation, yet he remained joyful. Can you share some of the examples of his joy and maybe share where that came from?
Yes, I mean, firstly, his character was a joyful character, but I think this grew in him because he offered up his life. He knew that God was with him. He knew he was doing God's will, and I think that gave him joy. And what's interesting is that at about the age of 20, he had a nervous breakdown because as a Jesuit student and seminarian, the building he was in went on fire. And the impact of that gave him a nervous shock, a nervous breakdown. He almost had to leave the Jesuits, but he was allowed back in. And we see this incredible transformation from somebody who was absolutely scared from a fire that he was in to, by the time 20 years later when he's in the war, being a rock of courage, but also of serenity and peace and joy, to the point where the soldiers flocked to him. And if there was a very heavy bombardment, they would find where Father Doyle was and hang out with him because he cheered them up just by being with him. But we see this joy in the letters that he wrote home to his father, because he's making light of his sufferings. He's telling jokes as he's recounting the dangers. He was surrounded by horrors. I mean, he talks about how he would wake up at night with rats crawling over him, fleas and other vermin, flies eating his food before he could get it into his mouth. But in all of this, he remains very serene, very calm, and very joyful. One of the defects that he had, we all have particular defects, but one of his defects was to be impatient. And he had an orderly or a servant because he had the rank of captain. And one of the ways that he tried to overcome this impatience was to let his servant do whatever he wanted. If his servant brought him food, he'd eat at that time. If the servant forgot to bring him food, he wouldn't ask for it and he wouldn't eat. And this joyfulness comes out with this acceptance of the way in which his servant treated him. He tried to be the slave of his servant. And that's one example of how he lived joy, just accepting those circumstances that he lived in the war.
Yeah. You mentioned his father, Hugh, and one of my favorite stories is the story of the man who is robbing his father. Can you share that?
That's right, yeah. So he had this great love of his father, and his father outlived him. He died at about the age of 90. And one day, not long before his death, he lived alone. He came down and there was a burglar in the house who was ransacking the house. The burglar didn't run away because this old man came down. He wasn't frightened by the old man. And as he was going through the drawers looking for things, he came across a photo of Father Willie. And he held it up and he said, "Who was this man to you?" And Hugh Doyle said, "He was my son." And the burglar said, "Well, this man saved a lot of men." And he kissed the picture and he put it in the pocket and he left. It's the only thing he took from the house. And evidently he was a soldier who had returned from the war. The soldiers who, and I know in the US you have a great love for your veterans. That wasn't here after the First World War because there was a lot of tension because the Irishmen were fighting in the British Army. So those men who came back from the First World War, having suffered a lot, weren't treated very well. He evidently was one of those men who'd fallen on hard times and was burglaring a house. But that's all he took. So he obviously kept that memory and that love for Father Doyle. And, you know, I often think what impact that had on Hugh Doyle, to see that here was a man who evidently was helped and saved by his son.
All right. Well, I want to make sure we can get a copy for people that need it. It is called To Raise the Fallen, a selection of the war letters, prayers, and spiritual writings of Father Willie Doyle, S.J. Available from Ignatius Press, also online, all the major retailers, your local Catholic bookstore. And it's been great to talk with you. Thank you so much, Dr. Patrick Kenny. Appreciate it.
Thanks, Kyle.